My golden child brother always had to outshine me. So, I let him shine his way into losing everything. I've had someone trying to erase me since the day I was born. My older brother Blake. If I said I jogged around the neighborhood, Blake would sign up for the Boston Marathon. If I picked up a violin, he'd hire the best guitar instructor in Nashville to master blues and rock. If I brought home a guy from college, he'd somehow end up dating a sorority president or local beauty queen within the week. I still cringe remembering how our golden retriever buddy used to follow me everywhere, sleeping by my bed, bringing me his favorite tennis ball. Blake couldn't stand it. He started feeding Buddy bacon strips, leftover steak, and premium dog treats until poor Buddy gained 30 pounds and could barely walk, but hey, now Buddy waited by Blake's chair at dinner every night. Growing up in our suburban Detroit home, everything became a competition I never signed up for. Blake was 2 years older, 6 inches taller, and according to our parents, destined for greatness. I was just Ashley, the younger sister who tried hard but never quite measured up. When I made honor roll sophomore year, Blake graduated valedictorian. When I got accepted to Michigan State with a partial scholarship, Blake got a full ride to Northwestern for pre-med. When I landed my first job at a marketing firm in Grand Rapids, Blake was already completing his residency at Johns Hopkins. Our parents, Mom and Dad Thompson, lived and breathed Blake's achievements. Every family barbecue, every holiday dinner, every phone call somehow centered around Blake's latest triumph. Blake just bought a house in Baltimore, Mom would announce to anyone who'd listen. Blake got promoted to chief resident, Dad would beam at the grocery store checkout. Meanwhile, I was building my own quiet life. I'd worked my way up to senior marketing coordinator, saved enough for a decent apartment, and was even dating a great guy named Cole who taught high school biology. But none of that mattered when Blake walked into a room. The worst part wasn't just being overlooked, it was how Blake seemed to actively sabotage any moment that might have been mine. When I announced my promotion at Sunday dinner, Blake casually mentioned he'd been offered department head at 28. When Cole and I got engaged, Blake showed up to the celebration party with Stephanie, a pharmaceutical sales rep who looked like she stepped off a magazine cover. By our late 20s, Blake's need to outshine me had turned from annoying to cruel. He'd turned my entire existence into his personal highlight reel, and our parents cheered him on every step of the way. But everything has consequences. And Blake was about to learn that the hard way. The competition turned vicious when real life started happening to our family. When I'd saved for 18 months to surprise Mom with a weekend getaway to Napa Valley for her 55th birthday, something she'd dreamed about since watching Sideways, Blake somehow found out. The week before our planned trip, he whisked her away to a luxury wine tour in Tuscany, complete with a private villa and cooking classes. "Ashley, honey," Mom called me from the vineyard, her voice giddy with expensive Chianti. Blake thought of the most wonderful surprise. "I told him about your sweet little Napa idea, but this is just so much more sophisticated." I spent that weekend alone in my apartment, holding 2 non-refundable plane tickets and a reservation at the bed and breakfast I'd carefully researched for months. When Cole's mother died unexpectedly in a car accident, I was devastated. Mrs. Henderson had welcomed me into their family, taught me her famous apple pie recipe, and always made me feel like the daughter she'd never had. I sent a modest floral arrangement with a heartfelt card to the funeral home, something simple but meaningful from Cole and me together. Blake, who'd met Cole exactly 3 times, sent a massive flower wall that covered half the funeral home entrance. The card read, "With deepest sympathy from the future family, Blake Thompson, MD. Cole's father pulled me aside at the service. "That doctor friend of yours is quite generous," he said, gesturing toward Blake's floral display. "Makes our family feel real supported during this hard time." I watched Blake work the room at the reception, introducing himself as family to Cole's relatives, discussing medical details of the accident with authority, playing the role of the caring boyfriend's brother. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in the corner, the actual girlfriend, invisible as always. But the cruelest cut came through social media. I'd struggled with depression after college, the constant comparison, the feeling of never being enough, the exhaustion of living in Blake's shadow. After 2 years of therapy and medication, I finally felt strong enough to share my story on Instagram, hoping to help other people who felt lost. My post was simple: 2 years ago, I couldn't get out of bed most mornings. Today, I hiked 10 miles and felt genuine joy watching the sunrise. Mental health is a journey, not a destination. To anyone struggling, you're not alone, and you're stronger than you know. The responses were overwhelming. Friends shared their own stories, strangers sent messages of support, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I'd done something that truly mattered. Then Blake commented publicly, "So proud of you for finally catching up to where I've been mentally for years, sis. Flex biceps always here if you need advice on maintaining emotional stability. Love seeing the baby sister grow up. Hashtag mental health matters, hashtag proud big brother." Hundreds of people liked his comment. Our family shared it. Mom called to tell me how mature and supportive Blake was being. I stared at that comment for hours, watching the likes pile up, watching my vulnerable moment become another opportunity for Blake to position himself as the wise older brother guiding his troubled little sister. That's when I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. The anger wasn't just simmering anymore, it was crystallizing into something much more dangerous. Purpose. Everything changed when Dad collapsed during his morning jog around our old neighborhood. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. 6 months, maybe less. I was the one who drove Dad to every appointment those first few weeks, sitting in sterile waiting rooms, taking notes during consultations, researching treatment options late into the night. Cole would bring us dinner at the hospital, knowing I wouldn't leave Dad's side during his chemo sessions. Dad and I developed this quiet routine. We'd arrive at the cancer center at 7 a.m., I'd read him sports highlights from my phone, and he'd tell me stories about his childhood in Ohio that I'd never heard before. During the long infusion hours, we'd watch old Western movies on my laptop, Dad providing commentary about historically accurate gunfights and horse breeds. "Ashley girl," he said one afternoon, squeezing my hand while saline dripped into his port. "I don't know what I'd do without you here." For 3 precious months, I had something Blake couldn't take away from me. I was Dad's caregiver, his companion, his comfort during the worst experience of his life. We talked about everything: my job, my relationship with Cole, his regrets about working too much when Blake and I were kids. "I'm proud of you," Dad whispered during one particularly brutal chemo session. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." Then Blake finished his residency. Suddenly, he was back in Michigan, moving into Mom and Dad's guest room, taking over with the authority of someone who actually understood medical terminology. He came to appointments with printed research, asked detailed questions about Dad's oncologist's recommendations, and spoke to nurses like the fellow medical professional he was. Within 2 weeks, I went from being Dad's primary support to being the daughter who got overwhelmed by medical stuff and should probably focus on emotional support instead. "Blake understands the treatment better," Mom explained when I found myself pushed out of consultation meetings. "It's better to have someone who can actually comprehend what the doctors are saying." But Blake wasn't just taking over Dad's care. He was rewriting history. I'd catch him having whispered conversations with Dad when they thought I couldn't hear. Conversations about financial planning, about my instability, about how I'd been struggling with depression, and might not be thinking clearly about the future. "Dad's worried about you spending so much time here instead of focusing on your career," Blake told me one evening in the hospital cafeteria. "He thinks maybe you're using his illness as an excuse to avoid dealing with your own problems." I stared at my brother, this man who'd returned home after 3 years of minimal contact and was now somehow the expert on what Dad thought and felt. "I've been here every day for 3 months, I said quietly. "And I'm here now," Blake replied, checking his Apple Watch. "With actual medical training. Maybe it's time to let the grown-ups handle this." That night, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and called Cole. "He's doing it again," I whispered into the phone. "He's taking this away from me too." But I had no idea how far Blake was willing to go until Dad stopped looking me in the eye. 3 weeks before Dad died, he started treating me like a stranger. It began with small things. Dad would ask Blake to adjust his pillows instead of me. He'd wait for Blake to return from his coffee runs before discussing how he was feeling. When I'd try to hold his hand during difficult moments, he'd pull away and ask for Blake instead. "What's wrong?" I finally asked Dad directly one afternoon when we were alone. "Did I do something?" Dad studied my face for a long moment, his eyes filled with disappointment that cut through me like glass. "Blake told me about the emails," he said quietly. "What emails?" "The ones about the will, Ashley. About waiting for me to die so you could get your inheritance." The room went completely silent except for the beeping of Dad's monitors. I felt like I'd been physically struck. "Dad, I never sent any emails about your will. I don't even know what's in your will," and I don't care. I'm here because I love you." But Dad was already shaking his head, looking at me with this mixture of hurt and disgust that I'd never seen before. "Blake showed them to me. Emails between you and Cole about how the medical bills were eating into your inheritance. About how you hoped the treatments wouldn't drag on too long because it was expensive." I started crying then, ugly desperate tears, because I realized what Blake had done. "Dad, those aren't real. Blake made those up. I would never." "Stop." Dad's voice was weak but firm. "Just stop, Ashley. I know you've been struggling since college, and I know money's been tight, but I never thought you'd actually wish for your father to die faster." I tried showing Dad my real emails, months of messages to Cole about Dad's treatment progress, about how scared I was, about researching clinical trials and experimental treatments. But Dad was too tired, too medicated, too heartbroken by what he thought I'd done. Blake had waited until Dad was most vulnerable, then poisoned him against me with fake evidence that I'd never have the chance to properly disprove. When I confronted Blake in the hospital parking lot that night, he didn't even bother denying it. "Show me the emails," I begged. "Show Dad that you made them up." Blake leaned against his BMW, checking his phone like this conversation was boring him. "I don't know what you're talking about, Ashley. Dad showed me emails from your account. If you didn't send them, maybe someone hacked you? Maybe you were drinking and don't remember." He shrugged. Either way, Dad finally sees which child actually cares about him versus which one sees him as a paycheck. "You're lying. You fabricated those emails." "Prove it," Blake said, getting into his car. "Oh wait, you can't." Because Dad's too sick to understand technical explanations, and he's already made up his mind about who the trustworthy child is. He started the engine and rolled down his window. "Don't embarrass yourself more than you already have, Ashley. Dad's got enough stress without you making wild accusations." I watched my brother drive away, knowing he'd just delivered the killing blow to my relationship with our dying father. And the worst part was, it worked perfectly. Dad died on a Thursday morning in October, and I wasn't there. Blake had convinced him that I was too emotional for the final stages, that my presence would make things harder for everyone. So while I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone and waiting for updates, Blake held Dad's hand and became the last person our father saw. The funeral was a masterpiece of Blake's manipulation. He'd planned everything: the service, the flowers, the reception venue. He chose Dad's favorite hymns, arranged for the American Legion Honor Guard since Dad was a veteran, and even had Dad's old work colleagues serve as pallbearers. I was relegated to the back row with distant relatives I barely knew. Blake delivered a 20-minute eulogy about being the son who was really there during Dad's final months. He talked about their late-night conversations about life and legacy. He shared intimate moments that should have been mine: Dad's concerns about the family's future, his pride in Blake's medical career, his hopes that Blake would carry on the Thompson family values. My father once told me that a man's true worth isn't measured by his success, but by how he cares for the people who depend on him, Blake said, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. "I'm grateful I could be here to care for him when he needed me most." The congregation nodded approvingly. People wiped away tears. Mom sobbed in the front row, clutching Blake's hand. I sat in the back, invisible, watching my brother steal even my grief. After the service, Mom pulled me aside with shaking hands and bloodshot eyes. "Ashley, honey, your father left you something." She handed me an envelope with my name written in Dad's deteriorating handwriting. Inside was a single page. "Ashley, I'm disappointed in you. I thought I raised you better than to see your family as dollar signs." Blake showed me the emails about the inheritance, about wanting the medical bills to stop draining your money. "I never thought my own daughter would wish for my death. I'm leaving everything to Blake because he's proven himself as the son who truly cares about family, not finances. I hope someday you can find the kind of character your brother has. I'm sorry you turned out this way, Dad." I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Dad had rewritten his will. The house, the retirement accounts, the small life insurance policy, everything went to Blake. I got nothing except this final letter of disappointment from a father who died believing I was a greedy, heartless person who'd been counting down the days until his death. Blake found me crying in the funeral home bathroom. "I'm sorry about the letter," he said, but his eyes were cold. "Dad was pretty hurt by those emails. I tried to convince him that maybe you didn't mean it the way it sounded, but..." He shrugged. You know how Dad was about integrity. You destroyed my relationship with him, I whispered. You took away my chance to say goodbye. I didn't take anything, Ashley. Your actions took it away. I just made sure Dad knew the truth about who he could count on. Blake straightened his tie and checked his appearance in the bathroom mirror. Don't worry about money, he added. Once everything's settled, I'll make sure you're taken care of. That's what big brothers do. He left me there, crumpled on the funeral home floor, holding the letter that proved I'd lost everything that mattered. But as I sat there, something crystallized inside me. Blake thought he'd won. He'd gotten the inheritance, the parents' approval, and the satisfaction of proving his superiority one final time. He had no idea that his greatest victory was about to become his biggest mistake. Because I knew something about Blake that he'd forgotten, his greed was predictable. His need to outshine me was compulsive. And I was about to use that against him. Blake's fatal flaw was that he could never resist taking anything I wanted. I spent 3 weeks researching the perfect bait, and I found it in an old warehouse district in downtown Detroit that was being converted into luxury lofts. The Riverside Commons development, a gorgeous renovation project with exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, and waterfront views of the Detroit River. At least, that's how it appeared on the surface. My friend Sarah from college worked in commercial real estate now, and she'd done me a favor by running a deep inspection on the property. What she found was a disaster waiting to happen: foundation issues from the original 1920s construction, black mold throughout the lower levels, and soil contamination from the chemical plant that had operated on the site for decades. The previous owner had spent a fortune staging the model units and covering up problems, but the environmental cleanup alone would cost millions. Add in the structural repairs, the lawsuits from current tenants who'd already started getting sick, and the massive tax liens that hadn't been properly disclosed, buying this property would be financial suicide. It was perfect. I started my performance at Mom's Sunday dinner, just Blake, Mom, and me picking at her famous pot roast and pretending we were still a family. I've been looking at investment properties, I mentioned casually, pushing carrots around my plate. There's this amazing development downtown, the Riverside Commons. The returns could be incredible. Blake barely looked up from his phone. Since when do you have investment money? I've been saving, I said, which was true. Plus Cole's been setting aside money from his teaching job. We're thinking about our future. Over the next 2 weeks, I escalated my obsession with the property. I brought printed financial projections to dinner, showing 300% returns over 5 years. I left real estate listings accidentally on Mom's counter when Blake was visiting. I complained loudly about how the bank was being difficult with my loan application. They want more documentation about my employment history, I sighed dramatically during one family dinner. Apparently marketing coordinators aren't as impressive as doctors when it comes to commercial loans. Blake's eyes lit up exactly as I'd predicted. The 3rd week, I played my final card. The bank rejected my application, I announced, letting my voice crack with disappointment. They said my debt-to-income ratio wasn't strong enough for a property that size. I pulled out fake rejection letters that Sarah had helped me create, complete with official bank letterhead and realistic language about loan requirements. I'm heartbroken, I told Mom while Blake listened from the kitchen. This was going to be my big break, you know? My chance to finally build some real wealth like Blake has. But I guess I'll just have to wait and save for a few more years. I made sure to leave all the property information spread across Mom's dining table, the beautiful photos, the projected rental income, the development timeline that showed units selling fast. I keep hoping maybe no one else will discover it, I said wistfully. Maybe I'll get another chance next year when my credit's even better. Blake took the bait within 48 hours. He'd done exactly one walkthrough of the staged model units, waived the inspection to move faster, and outbid my fake offer by $400,000. He used every penny of Dad's inheritance, plus loans that cleaned out his savings account, plus additional financing with Mom co-signing because the numbers looked so good on paper. The day he closed on the property, Blake couldn't resist calling me. Remember that building you couldn't afford? His voice was smug with satisfaction. Just like medical school, just like Dad's inheritance, just like everything else, you always come so close, Ashley, but never quite make it. I could hear the grin in his voice. Good thing I'm here to show you how it's really done. I said nothing and waited. Because Blake was about to learn that sometimes, the person who never quite makes it, is actually the person smart enough not to step into the trap. The first city inspector arrived exactly 1 week after Blake's closing. It was a routine check for new commercial property owners, something Blake would have known about if he'd done proper due diligence instead of rushing to beat my imaginary timeline. The inspector found foundation violations that required immediate attention and issued emergency citations that halted any renovation work. The environmental inspector followed 3 days later. Blake called me after the soil contamination report came back, and I could hear the panic creeping into his voice. "Did you know about environmental issues when you looked at this property?" he asked. "What environmental issues?" I replied innocently. "I thought you said the bank rejected my application because I couldn't handle a property that size." The tax lien discovery came in week 3. Apparently, the previous owner had hidden $800,000 in back taxes that automatically transferred to the new owner upon closing. Blake's lawyer, the one he'd hired for a quick closing instead of thorough due diligence, had missed it completely. By week 4, 3 separate tenant lawsuits had been filed. The families living in the lower units had been developing respiratory problems for months, and now they had a new owner with deeper pockets to sue. Blake appeared at my apartment on a Thursday evening, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and his hands were shaking when he knocked on my door. "You knew," he said the moment I opened it. "You knew about that building. You orchestrated this whole thing." I looked at my brother, this man who'd spent 30 years systematically destroying every moment of joy in my life, and felt absolutely nothing but satisfaction. "I couldn't even get approved for a loan," I said calmly, showing him the rejection letters he'd seen before. "Remember? You're the one who shows me how it's done. Those letters are fake. You planned this. You wanted me to buy that property knowing it would destroy me." "Prove it," I said, using his own words from the hospital parking lot. Blake's face crumpled then, and for the first time in our lives, he looked smaller than me. "Ashley, I'm going to lose everything. The repairs will cost $3 million minimum. The lawsuits could go on for years. Mom and Dad's house is collateral on the loans. I'll lose their home too." I watched him break down, watched 30 years of superiority drain out of him like air from a punctured balloon. "You destroyed my relationship with Dad," I said quietly. "You took away my chance to say goodbye to him. You made him die thinking I was a terrible person who wanted him dead." "I was protecting him." "You were protecting your inheritance," I interrupted. "And now you've lost it all trying to outshine me one more time." Blake fell silent, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. "I spent months researching that property," I continued. "I knew exactly what it would cost you. I knew you couldn't resist taking something that I wanted, even if you had to destroy yourself to get it." I stepped closer to my brother, this person who'd made my entire existence about proving I wasn't good enough. "You taught me that everything is a competition, Blake. You taught me that winning means making sure the other person loses. You taught me that family is just another battlefield." Blake stared at me, finally seeing his little sister clearly for the first time. "Congratulations," I said, closing the door. "You finally got to outshine me one last time. I hope it was worth everything." Through the window, I watched Blake sit in his car for 20 minutes before driving away. 3 months later, he filed for bankruptcy. Mom lost the house when the co-signed loans defaulted. Blake moved to Arizona to start over, taking a job at a small clinic for half his previous salary. I never heard from him again. Some people might say what I did was cruel, that families should forgive each other, that revenge doesn't heal the wounds. But those people never had a Blake. Sometimes, the only way to stop someone from destroying you is to let them destroy themselves. And sometimes, the little sister who never quite makes it is the one who's been playing the longest game all along.